The autumn wind whispered through the maple trees lining Cedar Street, scattering a sea of red and gold leaves across the manicured lawns of suburban Boston. Inside one of the houses, 7-year-old Ethan Baker sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, meticulously organizing his Hot Wheels cars by color. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting soft shadows on the blue carpet his mother had chosen when they moved in 3 years ago. The warm hues of the room, with its pale yellow walls and shelves stacked with books and toys, gave it a cozy feel. But Ethan's focus was entirely on his miniature cars, carefully lining them up in perfect rows. Downstairs, the familiar sounds of Richard, his stepfather, preparing dinner filled the air pots clinking, vegetables being chopped, and occasional muttered sighs of irritation. For Ethan, these noises were background music to his solitary play. He paused briefly, tilting his head as he listened to the rhythmic chopping. The sound was repetitive, almost mechanical, and it echoed faintly up the stairs. To Ethan, it was a constant reminder of Richard's presence, firm, unyielding, and sometimes unnerving. He reached for a bright yellow Corvette, one of his favorites, when hurried footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Ethan glanced up just as Lily, his 12-year-old sister, passed his room. She was moving quickly, almost like she wanted to disappear into her own space. Her long brown hair swayed behind her, a curtain that seemed to shield her from the world. Ethan noticed the oversized gray sweater she was wearing, the same one she had barely taken off since school started. It hung loosely on her frame, almost swallowing her petite figure. Ethan furrowed his brow. Lily wasn't like this before. He remembered when she used to laugh loudly, her laughter filling the house with warmth. She would play with him after school, helping him build elaborate racetracks across the living room floor, or reading stories to him in silly voices. Those days felt like a distant memory now. Things had changed since Richard moved in. Mom started working longer shifts at the hospital, and Lily became quiet. Her bright personality dimmed like a light hidden behind a heavy curtain. Ethan's small hands hesitated over the Corvette as he listened to Lily's door creak open and close. Her footsteps, once quick and lively, now sounded slow and hesitant. Ethan's curiosity got the better of him. He abandoned his cars and crawled to the edge of his doorway, peering down the hallway. Lily's door was slightly ajar, and he could see her leaning against it for a moment, as if gathering her strength. "Lily!" Richard's voice boomed from downstairs, breaking the quiet. It was sharp, commanding, and left no room for argument. "Get down here and set the table." Ethan's heart raced slightly at the tone. He saw Lily straighten up abruptly, her body stiffening at the sound. She took a deep breath, then stepped out into the hallway. Her eyes were downcast, and her shoulders were hunched, as if she wanted to make herself invisible. Ethan watched silently, his small frame tucked against the edge of the doorway. As Lily descended the stairs, her hand trailed along the banister, her movements deliberate and almost cautious. Ethan noticed how her sweater sleeves were pulled over her hands, concealing them completely. She seemed to shrink with every step, her once confident posture replaced by a timid, subdued presence. This wasn't the Lily he used to know. He remembered how she used to leap down the stairs, 2 at a time, her energy boundless. Now, it was like she was carrying an invisible weight that slowed her down. Ethan's small legs carried him quietly to the top of the stairs. He sat on the middle step, careful to remain out of sight. From his vantage point, he could see into the kitchen. Richard stood at the stove, his broad back turned to Lily. At 39, Richard Cooper was an imposing figure. Tall and solidly built, with dark hair that was just starting to gray at the temples, he had a presence that demanded attention. To the outside world, he was Mr. Cooper, the respected middle school teacher who sometimes helped coach Little League. But at home, he was different. "What took you so long?" Richard snapped without turning around as Lily entered the kitchen. His voice carried a sharp edge, one that made Ethan's chest tighten. Lily didn't respond. She walked to the cabinet and began taking out plates, her movements quick and efficient. But Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the dishes. "Can't you do anything right?" Richard's voice cut through the air like a knife as one of the plates slipped slightly in Lily's hand. It didn't fall, but the slight clatter was enough to draw his ire. Lily flinched, her body stiffening, as she quickly set the plate down on the counter. "Clumsy little brat," Richard muttered under his breath. "Pick it up and do it right this time." Ethan's small hands gripped the banister tightly as he watched the scene unfold. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and anger swirling inside him. He wanted to say something, to tell Richard to stop being mean to Lily. But the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, like it was wrapped in invisible chains. Lily quickly complied, her hands moving with a shaky urgency as she set the plates on the table. Richard turned from the stove, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. Lily froze, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Richard demanded, his voice low and controlled. It was the kind of tone that sent chills down Ethan's spine. Lily raised her head slowly, her face pale and tight, like she was holding her breath. Her eyes, once so full of life, now looked dull and tired. "What's wrong with you lately?" Richard continued, his tone dripping with disdain. "Your mother told me about your math test. Are you trying to embarrass me at school?" "No," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'll do better." "Sorry doesn't cut it," Richard snapped. "You're lucky your mother works so hard to support you kids. The least you could do is show some gratitude by not acting like an idiot." Ethan's knuckles turned white as he gripped the banister tighter. His small frame trembled with suppressed emotion. He wanted to rush down the stairs, to stand between Richard and Lily, to shout at him to leave her alone. But the memory of last week held him back. The last time he tried to defend Lily, Richard had sent him to his room without supper, telling him that little boys should mind their own business. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the tense silence. Richard's demeanor shifted instantly. He stepped back from Lily, his expression softening as he turned toward the door. "Your mom's home," he said, his tone suddenly warm and pleasant. "Finish setting the table." Lily nodded quickly and resumed her task, her movements mechanical. Ethan remained frozen on the stairs, his young mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. He watched as their mom, Grace Baker, entered the kitchen carrying grocery bags. She looked tired, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled, and her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, but she greeted them with a smile. "Something smells good," Grace said, setting the bags on the counter. "What's for dinner?" "Just trying something new with the chicken," Richard replied, his voice warm and cheerful now. "Lily, why don't you help your mother with the groceries instead of standing around?" Ethan watched as Lily hurried to comply, her movements quick and nervous. Grace didn't seem to notice. She was already chatting with Richard about her day at work, her attention focused on unpacking the groceries. From his spot on the stairs, Ethan felt a deep sense of confusion. How could they not see what he saw? How could they not feel the tension that filled the air like an invisible fog? He remained on the stairs, invisible to the scene below, his small heart heavy with emotions he couldn't yet name. And as he sat there, watching the family scene unfold, he whispered a silent promise to himself. One day, he would do something. One day, he would find the courage to protect his sister, the way she used to protect him. Lily's footsteps echoed softly on the wooden floor as she moved about the kitchen, placing plates and silverware onto the table. Her hands were quick but unsteady, and her head remained bowed as if she hoped to avoid drawing any attention to herself. Richard stood at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic. The warm, inviting aroma clashed sharply with the tension that seemed to permeate the room. From his spot on the stairs, Ethan watched closely. His small body was hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees and his chin cupped in his hands. He could feel the uneasy rhythm of the household, like a clock ticking just a little too loudly. Lily moved like a shadow, quick and silent, her presence barely acknowledged by Richard, except for the occasional sharp command. "Don't forget the napkins." Richard snapped without looking up from the pot he was stirring. His voice carried that familiar edge that always made Ethan's stomach twist. "I'm getting them now," Lily replied, her voice small and flat. She opened a drawer, her hand trembling slightly as she pulled out a stack of napkins. "Careful," Richard warned, glancing over his shoulder. "Don't drop them like you did last time. We don't need you making a mess again." Lily's cheeks flushed a deep red, but she didn't say anything. She placed the napkins on the table, her movements precise and deliberate. Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her body seemed to shrink with every word Richard threw at her. It was like she was trying to disappear, to fade into the background where she wouldn't be noticed. Ethan's hands tightened on the edge of the stair railing. He hated seeing Lily like this. She used to be so lively, so full of energy and laughter. Now, she barely spoke, and when she did, her words were clipped and cautious. Ethan didn't fully understand what had changed, but he knew it had something to do with Richard. Richard turned back to the stove, his movements smooth and practiced. To anyone else, he might have looked like the perfect picture of domesticity, a man cooking dinner for his family. But Ethan knew better. He'd seen the way Richard's smile disappeared as soon as Mom wasn't looking. The way his words became sharp and cruel the moment they were alone. The clatter of a fork hitting the floor jolted Ethan out of his thoughts. His eyes darted to Lily, who was crouching down to pick up the utensil she had dropped. Her movements were quick, almost frantic, as if she expected Richard to explode at any moment. "Clumsy?" Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. "Can't even handle a simple task without screwing it up." Lily froze for a moment, her hand hovering over the fork. Ethan could see her shoulders tremble slightly, and he wanted nothing more than to rush down the stairs and snatch the fork away so she wouldn't have to face Richard's wrath. But he stayed where he was, his small body pressed against the railing, his breath caught in his throat. "I'm sorry," Lily mumbled as she stood up, clutching the fork in her hand. She placed it in the sink and grabbed a clean one from the drawer, her face carefully blank. Richard sighed loudly, as if her apology was an inconvenience to him. He turned off the stove and wiped his hands on a dish towel before turning to face Lily. He crossed the kitchen in 2 long strides, his imposing figure looming over her. Lily flinched slightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Richard demanded, his voice low and firm. Lily hesitated for a moment before lifting her head. Her eyes met Richard's, and Ethan could see the fear in them from where he sat on the stairs. It wasn't just fear of punishment, it was something deeper, something that made Ethan's chest ache. "What's wrong with you lately?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with frustration. "Your mother told me about your math test. Are you trying to embarrass me at school? Do you think it's fun for me to get emails from your teachers about how poorly you're doing?" "No," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, I'll do better." "Sorry doesn't cut it," Richard snapped. "You're lucky your mother worked so hard to support you kids. The least you could do is show some gratitude by not acting like an idiot." Ethan's grip on the banister tightened until his knuckles turned white. His chest felt heavy, like it was full of stones. He wanted to shout at Richard, to tell him to stop talking to Lily like that, but he couldn't. The words wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere deep inside him, tangled up in the fear that he couldn't quite put into words. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the tension. Richard straightened up, his expression softening as if someone had flipped a switch. "Your mom's home," he said, his tone suddenly warm and pleasant. He stepped back from Lily, giving her just enough space to exhale. "Finish setting the table." Lily nodded quickly, her movements hurried and mechanical as she placed the last of the silverware on the table. Ethan remained frozen on the stairs, his small body pressed against the wooden railing. He watched as his mom, Grace, entered the kitchen carrying grocery bags. She looked tired, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled, and her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. But she smiled as she stepped inside, her eyes lighting up at the sight of Richard at the stove. "Something smells good," Grace said, setting the bags down on the counter. "What's for dinner?" "Just trying something new with the chicken," Richard replied, his voice full of warmth and cheer. He stepped forward to kiss her on the cheek, his demeanor so drastically different from moments before that Ethan felt a pang of confusion. How could someone change so quickly? How could someone hide their true self so easily? "Lily," Richard said, his voice still pleasant but with a hint of command. "Why don't you help your mother with the groceries instead of standing around?" Lily hurried to obey, her movements quick and efficient as she began unpacking the bags. Grace didn't seem to notice the tension in her daughter's posture or the way her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a carton of milk. She was already chatting with Richard about her day at work, her voice light and casual. From his spot on the stairs, Ethan felt a deep sense of unease. How could his mom not see what was happening? How could she not feel the weight of the air in the room, the way it seemed to press down on everyone except Richard? Ethan stayed on the stairs, invisible to the scene below. He watched as Lily moved like a ghost through the kitchen, her presence barely acknowledged except when Richard decided to criticize her. And he made a silent promise to himself. One day, he would find the courage to do something. One day, he would find a way to protect Lily, the way she used to protect him. The house had grown quiet as night fell, with only the occasional creak of the floorboards breaking the stillness. Ethan lay on his bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars that were stuck to his ceiling. The soft green light they emitted provided a faint comfort, but his mind was restless. He could hear faint sounds from his sister Lily's room. The muffled creak of her bed as she shifted. The faint hum of her voice, murmuring words he couldn't make out. There was a sadness to the sound, a weight that made his small chest feel tight. Ethan hugged his stuffed dinosaur, Rex, closer to his chest. Rex had been his constant companion since his 5th birthday, a gift from Lily. She had painted a tiny picture of Rex on the tag, complete with a speech bubble saying, "I'm your best friend." Every time Ethan looked at it, he was reminded of the Lily he used to know, the Lily who made him laugh with her silly voices, who helped him build pillow forts, who sang Taylor Swift songs loudly and off-key just to make him smile. But now, that Lily seemed to be disappearing, slipping away into the shadows of their house. From the room next to his, Ethan could hear the faintest sound of shaky breathing. It wasn't crying, not quite, but it was close. It was the sound Lily made when she was trying not to cry, when she was trying to keep everything bottled up so no one would notice. Ethan's fingers tightened around Rex's soft green fur. He wanted to go to her, to climb into her bed like she used to do for him when he had nightmares. But he didn't move. Something inside him told him it wasn't the right time. Instead, he whispered into Rex's ear, "Please keep Lily safe. Please make Richard be nice. Please help Mom see." Ethan's grandmother had taught him to pray when he was scared, and he clung to that now. The words felt small and fragile, like a paper boat in a stormy sea, but they were all he had. Downstairs, the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen. The house was old, and the walls and floors carried every creak and shuffle of movement. Ethan's ears were finely tuned to those sounds now, and he noticed every shift in the air. He'd learned to distinguish between the reassuring rhythm of his mother's footsteps and the heavier, deliberate steps of Richard. Tonight, the house was unnervingly still, as if it too was holding its breath. Lily's voice echoed in his mind from earlier that day. She had spoken so softly, barely lifting her head when Richard asked her questions. "Speak up," Richard had demanded, his tone sharp and impatient. Ethan could still see the way Lily's shoulders hunched forward, her face pale and tense as she muttered a response. Ethan hated that Richard made Lily so quiet, so afraid to be herself. He missed the way she used to tease him, her laughter ringing through the house. Now, it was like she was a shadow of herself, moving quietly, trying not to attract attention. The night stretched on, and Ethan's thoughts swirled in his head like leaves caught in a gust of wind. He thought about the times Richard had snapped at him, the way his voice could turn cold and sharp in an instant. But it was different with Lily. Richard seemed to have a special anger reserved for her, an unrelenting criticism that made Ethan's stomach twist. Miss Collins' voice came to him suddenly, clear and steady, from the safety assembly at school last week. "If you think someone is in danger," she had said, "you should call for help. That's why we have 911. The operators are there to help you, day or night. You don't have to face scary things alone." Ethan hadn't thought much about it at the time. Danger had seemed like something far away, something that happened in other families. But now, as he lay in his bed, he began to wonder, was Lily in danger? Was this the kind of thing Miss Collins had meant? He rolled onto his side, staring at the faint outline of Rex's face in the dim light. "What do you think, Rex?" he whispered. "Should I call? Would they even believe me?" The idea of dialing those 3 numbers made his heart race. He imagined a police car pulling up to their house, lights flashing red and blue, neighbors peeking out of their windows. It seemed too big, too serious. But then he thought about Lily's quiet, shaky breathing, about the way her hands trembled when she reached for a plate, about the bruises he'd glimpsed on her wrist last week when her sweater sleeve had slipped up. His stomach churned with worry. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window panes. Ethan pulled his blanket up to his chin, his mind racing. He thought about his mom, about how tired she looked when she came home from work, how she seemed to miss everything that was happening right under her nose. She always said Richard was a good man, that he was helping out the family. But Ethan wasn't so sure. He didn't feel safe around Richard, and he could tell Lily didn't either. The sound of a siren wailing in the distance caught Ethan's attention. It rose and fell, brief and fleeting, before fading away into the night. He wondered who it was for, what had happened, and whether the person who had called felt scared too. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. Ethan squeezed Rex tightly and closed his eyes, trying to push the worry away. But the image of Lily's pale, frightened face wouldn't leave his mind. He felt a deep ache in his chest, a helplessness that was almost too much for his small body to bear. He wanted to fix things, to make everything better for Lily, but he didn't know how. He was just a kid. What could he do? The prayer he had whispered earlier played over and over in his mind, like a song stuck on repeat. Please keep Lily safe. Please make Richard be nice. Please help Mom see. He thought about what Miss Collins had said again. You don't have to face scary things alone. Maybe she was right. Maybe calling for help wasn't about being big or strong. Maybe it was just about doing what you could, even if you were scared. As the house settled into its nighttime quiet, Ethan made a decision. He didn't know what was going to happen, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. If things got worse, if Lily needed him, he would find a way to be brave. Even if his voice shook, even if his hands trembled, he would do what needed to be done. Because that's what Lily would have done for him. With that thought, Ethan finally closed his eyes, his grip on Rex loosening slightly. The faint sound of the wind outside became a lullaby, and his breathing slowed as he drifted into an uneasy sleep. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he could still hear the siren, a faint echo of the help he didn't yet realize he would soon be calling for. For now, though, he held on to the fragile hope that his whispered prayers might be enough to keep his sister safe for one more night. Morning arrived with a pale glow filtering through the blinds in Lily's bedroom, casting thin beams of light onto the walls. She sat on the edge of her unmade bed, pulling the sleeves of her oversized sweater down over her hands. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the coffee maker downstairs and the occasional clink of dishes as Richard prepared breakfast. She took a deep breath, willing herself to move, but her limbs felt heavy. Lily, you're going to be late. Her mom's voice called up the stairs, tinged with the usual morning rush. Lily stood, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. Her movements were mechanical, like she was operating on autopilot. She glanced at the mirror on her dresser and saw her reflection staring back at her pale face, tired eyes, and hair that looked like it hadn't been brushed properly in days. She tugged her sleeves down again, ensuring they covered her wrists completely, and turned away. Downstairs, the kitchen buzzed with the kind of chaos that came with early mornings. Ethan sat at the table, swinging his legs as he spooned cereal into his mouth. His Spider-Man backpack rested on the chair beside him, ready for school. Richard stood at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His presence seemed to fill the room, commanding attention even though he wasn't speaking. Lily entered the kitchen quietly, her footsteps light as if she were trying not to disturb the fragile balance of the morning. Ethan noticed her first, looking up from his cereal with a small smile. "Morning, Lily," he said. His voice was cheerful, but his eyes were serious, watching her carefully. He'd gotten good at reading the unspoken signals in their house. "Morning," Lily replied softly, avoiding his gaze. She walked to the counter and grabbed a slice of toast, nibbling on it without much interest. "Is that all you're eating?" Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. Lily flinched, her hand pausing mid-motion as she reached for a glass of water. "I'm not hungry," she mumbled, keeping her eyes on the countertop. "Not hungry," Richard repeated, his tone sharp. "That's no excuse. You need to eat properly, especially since you quit soccer. Getting lazy isn't going to help your grades improve." Grace walked into the kitchen just as Richard finished speaking. She was already dressed for her shift at the hospital, her scrubs freshly ironed and her travel mug of coffee in hand. She frowned at Richard's words, but didn't say anything, instead turning her attention to Lily. "You quit soccer?" Grace asked, her tone a mix of surprise and concern. Lily nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Last week," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to play anymore." "But you love soccer," Grace protested. "You've been playing since you were 6. What changed?" Lily shrugged, avoiding her mother's eyes. "I don't know. I just don't feel like it anymore." Richard stepped in, his voice smooth and authoritative. "Kids change, Grace. They lose interest in things, though the timing could be better, considering her recent academic performance." He glanced at his watch. "We need to get going. I have a faculty meeting this morning." The drive to school was tense. Ethan sat in the back seat, humming quietly to himself as he looked out the window. Lily sat in the passenger seat, pressed against the door, as if trying to create as much space between herself and Richard as possible. The radio played softly in the background, filling the silence with upbeat pop songs that felt jarringly out of place. As they approached the elementary school, Richard pulled into the drop-off lane. He turned to Ethan, his tone noticeably lighter. "Have a good day, champ," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair in a gesture that felt more performative than genuine. Ethan hesitated as he opened the car door. "Lily, will you come to my class's art show next week? I made something really cool." Before Lily could respond, Richard cut in. Your sister needs to her grades, champ. Maybe another time. Ethan's face fell, but he nodded. Okay, he said quietly, sliding out of the car with his backpack slung over one shoulder. As soon as Ethan closed the door, the atmosphere in the car shifted. The lightness in Richard's tone disappeared, replaced by something colder. He pulled away from the elementary school and turned toward Lily's middle school, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Remember what we talked about, he said, his voice low and menacing. No more embarrassing behavior. You're better than that, aren't you? Lily nodded mutely, her hands clutching her backpack so tightly that her knuckles turned white. They reached her school, but instead of pulling into the drop-off zone, Richard steered the car into a secluded corner of the teacher's parking lot. He put the car in park and turned to face her. Look at me, he demanded. Lily hesitated, then forced herself to meet his gaze. Her hands trembled in her lap, and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. You're making me look bad, Richard said, his voice laced with contempt. Your mother works her ass off to support you kids, and this is how you repay her, with D's on your math tests and a bad attitude? I'm sorry, Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Sorry isn't good enough, Richard snapped. Shape up. No more D's. No more sulking around the house like some pathetic victim. And remember, his voice dropped even lower. His words deliberate. One word to anyone about our private conversations, and things will get much worse. Do you understand? Lily nodded quickly, fumbling with her seatbelt as she practically fell out of the car in her haste to escape. She hurried across the parking lot, her head down, her shoulders hunched. Other students streamed past her, laughing and chatting, their voices blending into a dull roar. No one seemed to notice the girl in the oversized sweater clutching her books to her chest like armor. Richard watched her go, his expression unreadable, before pulling out of the parking lot and heading toward his meeting. Inside the school, Lily made her way to her locker, her hands shaking as she spun the combination lock. She focused on the task in front of her, trying to block out the memory of Richard's voice, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a physical burden. In the back of her mind, she thought of Ethan. She pictured his small, hopeful face as he asked her to come to his art show. She wanted to go, wanted to see the project he was so excited about, but she knew she wouldn't be able to keep that promise. Not while Richard's shadow loomed so large over their lives. As the first bell rang, signaling the start of the school day, Lily took a deep breath and closed her locker. She squared her shoulders, trying to muster the strength to get through another day. But inside, she felt like she was shrinking, piece by piece, as the walls around her grew higher and higher. The house was cloaked in darkness, the stillness broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, carefully pouring milk over his second bowl of Cheerios. It was a rare treat he allowed himself when his mom worked the night shift at the hospital, leaving him and Lily alone with Richard. Tonight, the house felt different, tighter somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. Ethan had learned to notice these shifts, the subtle changes that signaled trouble. Across the table, Lily poked at her own bowl of cereal. She hadn't taken a single bite. Her oversized gray sweater hung loosely on her small frame, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the spoon. Her hair fell in a curtain over her face, shielding her expression from Ethan's curious eyes. I can make you something else if you want, Lily offered quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe a grilled cheese? Before Ethan could respond, Richard's voice boomed from the living room. He's already eating. Stop trying to baby him and get up here, Lily. The sudden sharpness in his tone made both siblings flinch. I need help grading these papers since you're so familiar with failing grades. Ethan watched as Lily's knuckles whitened around her spoon. She hesitated for a moment and rose from her chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor. I'll be back soon, she whispered to Ethan, forcing a faint smile. You can finish up here, okay? Ethan nodded, his small hands gripping his bowl tightly as Lily headed upstairs. He noticed she was still wearing her sweater, even though the house was warm. His gaze followed her until she disappeared, and then he turned his attention back to his cereal. But his appetite had vanished. The sound of muffled voices drifted down from upstairs, low and indistinct at first. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, sharp, cutting, and full of anger. He slid off his chair and crept toward the stairs, moving as quietly as possible in his socks. As he climbed, the voices grew louder. Richard's harsh tone filled the air. words like worthless and embarrassment, cutting through the silence like shards of glass. "Why can't you do anything right?" Richard demanded, his voice laced with contempt. "You're pathetic. A waste of time." "I'm sorry." Lily's voice trembled, barely audible. "I'll do better, I promise." "Sorry isn't good enough," Richard shouted. And then came the sound of something crashing a book, a stack of papers. Ethan couldn't tell, but what followed made his heart pound in his chest. It was Lily's voice, catching on a sob as if she was trying not to cry. Then, a sharp thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. Ethan froze on the stairs, his small body tensing with fear. His breathing quickened as he clutched the banister, his mind racing. He thought of Miss Collins' words from the safety assembly at school. "If you think someone is in danger, call 911. The operators are there to help, day or night." The sound of another crash snapped Ethan out of his thoughts. He glanced down the hallway toward the kitchen, where the cordless phone sat on the counter. His feet moved before his brain caught up, carrying him quickly but silently down the stairs. He grabbed the phone with trembling hands and ducked into the pantry, closing the door behind him. The small space was dark and cramped, the smell of spices and canned goods filling his nose. He pressed the numbers 9-1 to 1H, his fingers shaking so much he almost dropped the phone. It rang once, then twice, before a calm voice answered. 911, what's your emergency?" Ethan swallowed hard, his voice coming out smaller than he intended. "I think my sister's getting hurt." "Okay, sweetheart," the operator said gently. "You're very brave for calling. Can you tell me your name and where you are?" "My name is Ethan Baker," he whispered, clutching the phone tightly. "We live at 247 Cedar Street." Another crash from upstairs made him jump, and he pressed himself deeper into the corner of the pantry. "Please hurry," he begged, his voice cracking. "It's my stepdad, Richard. He's hurting Lily." "I'm sending officers to your house right now," the operator assured him. "They'll be there very soon. Can you stay on the phone with me, Ethan?" "I think I hear them," Ethan said suddenly as the faint sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet neighborhood. Red and blue lights began to flash through the windows, painting the walls with streaks of color. "Ethan, I need you to stay somewhere safe," the operator instructed. "Don't try to go upstairs or stop anything. Just stay hidden, okay?" Ethan nodded, even though the operator couldn't see him. He stayed curled in the pantry, his heart racing as heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, and the sound of Richard's angry voice filled the house. "What the hell is going on?" Richard bellowed as the front door burst open. The sound of authoritative voices followed police officers shouting commands, their words blending together in a blur of urgency. "Police, everyone stay where you are." Ethan hugged his knees to his chest, tears streaming down his face as he listened to the chaos unfold. There were more footsteps, more voices, and then a female officer's voice cut through the noise. "We need medical assistance upstairs." The pantry door creaked open, and Ethan flinched, clutching the phone tightly. A tall officer knelt down in front of him, his face kind but serious. "Hey there, buddy. Are you Ethan?" he asked gently. Ethan nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "You did a really brave thing tonight," the officer said, holding out his hand. "Come on out. Your sister's going to be okay." Ethan hesitated, then slowly took the officer's hand and stepped out of the pantry. His gaze darted to the stairs, where paramedics were carefully carrying Lily down on a stretcher. Her face was tear-streaked and bruised, but when her eyes found Ethan's, something flickered in her expression: relief, gratitude, and pride all at once. As Richard was led out of the house in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage, the officer knelt beside Ethan again, blocking his view. "Don't look at him," the officer said firmly. "You did the right thing, son." Ethan clutched the phone to his chest, his small body trembling. For the first time that night, he felt a tiny flicker of hope. The cold fluorescent light in the small interview room cast long shadows on the walls, but it was warmer than it looked. Ethan sat on a chair too big for his small frame, his legs swinging nervously above the floor. Clutching Rex, his stuffed dinosaur, he looked down at the worn green fur, as though it could shield him from the questions he knew were coming. Across the table sat Detective Diana Chun, a woman with kind eyes and a steady demeanor. She slid a cup of hot chocolate toward Ethan, steam curling upward in the chilly air. "That's a cool dinosaur," she said, her tone casual and non-threatening. "Does he have a name?" Rex, Ethan replied quietly, running his fingers over the stuffed toy's faded fabric. Lily gave him to me for my birthday last year. At the mention of his sister's name, his small hands tightened around Rex and his lip trembled slightly. Through the observation window, Grace Baker paced back and forth. She was still in her nurse's scrubs, her blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her face pale and drawn. Beside her stood Dr. Rachel Morris, a child psychologist who had been brought in to support Ethan. Grace's worried eyes darted between the window and the hallway, where officers were briefing her about Lily's condition. Inside the room, Detective Chun leaned forward slightly, her tone gentle. "Ethan, can you tell me what happened tonight? Why you called 911? Ethan's face scrunched up in concentration, his small fingers picking at Rex's seams. "Miss Collins," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's my teacher. She told us about calling 911 last week. She said if we think someone is in danger, we should call right away." He looked up at the detective, his eyes wide and filled with guilt. "I waited too long, didn't I? I should have called before." The admission hit Detective Chun like a blow to the chest. She kept her voice steady, her expression calm. "You did exactly the right thing, Ethan. You were very brave to call. None of this is your fault." Ethan's fingers gripped Rex tighter as he continued, his voice trembling but determined. "Richard hurt Lily, not just tonight, lots of times. He says mean things to her, makes her feel bad." He paused, his face darkening with anger. "She stopped playing soccer and hanging out with her friend Sophie. She wears big sweaters all the time now, even when it's hot." Detective Chun nodded, making gentle notes in her notebook. She didn't interrupt, letting Ethan speak at his own pace. "Tonight," Ethan continued, his voice growing quieter, "I heard him yelling at her. He called her stupid and worthless. Then I heard her cry." He took a shaky breath, tears welling in his eyes. "She always tries to be quiet about it, but I knew something was wrong." Chun's pen paused on the page. "What made you decide to call 911, Ethan?" Ethan's small shoulders squared slightly, as if gathering strength. "Miss Collins said the operators are there to help. She said it's better to call than to wait." He looked down at Rex again, his voice soft. "I didn't want him to hurt her anymore." There was a soft knock on the door, and Dr. Morris stepped in, her gentle presence filling the room. "Ethan, your mom would like to see you. Would that be okay?" Ethan nodded, sliding off the chair but keeping a firm grip on Rex. At the door, he paused and turned back to Detective Chun. "Is Lily going to be okay?" Chun smiled reassuringly. "The doctors are taking good care of her. She's very proud of you, Ethan. You helped her a lot tonight." After Ethan left, Chun sat alone for a moment, staring at her notes. The details painted a stark picture: verbal abuse, intimidation, and now physical violence. The preliminary medical report from the hospital confirmed Lily's injuries, bruises in various stages of healing, a sprained wrist, and signs of prolonged emotional trauma. But it was Ethan's testimony that weighed heaviest on Chun's mind. A 7-year-old boy should never have to carry such a burden. Down the hall, Grace sat in a conference room with Dr. Morris, her hands trembling as she clutched a steaming cup of coffee. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "How did I not see this?" she whispered, her voice hollow. "I thought I was providing for them. I thought Richard was helping, taking care of them while I worked." Dr. Morris placed a comforting hand on Grace's arm. "Abusers are often skilled at manipulation," she said gently. "They create isolation, make their victims feel powerless and ashamed. Richard used his position in your family to control Lily and ensure she wouldn't speak up." Grace's hands clenched around her cup. "All those times he offered to help with her homework, to drive them to school. I thanked him for it. I thought he was being kind. But he was..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "The important thing now," Dr. Morris said firmly, "is that Lily and Ethan are safe. Lily will need support, both physical and emotional, and so will Ethan. He's been incredibly brave, but what he witnessed and experienced will take time to process." Grace nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I want to do whatever it takes. I'll take time off work. I'll go to therapy with them. Anything to help them heal." Across town, in a pediatric hospital room, Lily lay in bed, her face pale against the white pillow. She was finally asleep, sedated after the chaos of the evening. On the bedside table sat a small clay turtle, painted in bright blues and greens. A note, written in wobbly 7-year-old handwriting, rested beside it. To Lily, made this at school for you. I love you, Ethan. Detective Chun closed her notebook and added one final line. Primary witness Ethan Baker demonstrated remarkable courage and awareness in recognizing and reporting abuse. Recommend follow-up with victim support services for both children. She paused, then added, special attention should be given to maintaining the sibling bond between Ethan and Lily, as it is a critical source of support for both. The night shift was ending, but the work was far from over. The silence that had shrouded the Baker home for so long had finally been broken, and in its place, the first steps toward healing were beginning. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of Detective Diana Chun's office, painting stripes of gold across her cluttered desk. Files and notes from the Baker case were spread out in front of her, each piece forming part of the horrifying puzzle. She had spent the entire night reviewing documents, medical reports, and now the personnel files from the schools Richard Cooper had previously worked at. Her partner, Detective Marcus Torres, walked in with a steaming cup of coffee and a grim expression. You've got to take a break, Diana, he said, setting the coffee down. Chun shook her head. Look at this, she said, pointing to the timeline she had constructed on the whiteboard. Richard Cooper has a pattern. Lakewood Middle School in 2018, Pine Valley Academy in 2020, Riverside Middle School in 2022, and now here. All transfers requested mid-year, all with glowing recommendations and minimal documentation. And at every school, there's at least one informal complaint filed by a female student. Torres leaned in, studying the board. Sounds like he was escalating. Maybe the complaints were getting closer to exposing him, so he moved before anyone could dig deeper. Classic predator behavior, Chun agreed, tapping her pen against the desk. But this time, he didn't just rely on emotional abuse. With Lily, he escalated to physical violence because she was in his home, completely isolated. She couldn't escape. The door to Chun's office swung open, and a uniformed officer entered, holding a thick manila envelope. Mail from Riverside Middle, he said, handing it over. Margaret Winters, the retired vice principal, sent this over. Said she kept copies of everything. Chun opened the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were years' worth of notes, observations, and documentation. Every incident involving Richard Cooper was meticulously recorded. A female student crying in the bathroom after being berated. A concerned parent's call, complaints of inappropriate comments made to vulnerable students. Why didn't she report this earlier? Torres asked, skimming through the documents. She tried. Chun replied, her voice heavy with frustration. But Cooper was careful. No hard evidence, just whispers. And every time she started to piece something together, he'd transfer. She sighed, running a hand through her hair, but she kept tracking him. She knew someone would need this someday. Across town, Grace Baker sat in the conference room of her lawyer's office, staring at the divorce papers in front of her. The words blurred together. Irreconcilable differences, sole custody, restraining order. Her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Graham, was explaining the school district's liability in the case. The district wants to settle, Linda said. They're facing serious scrutiny for failing to investigate the previous incidents involving Richard. This could ensure financial security for your family, Grace. Grace shook her head. I don't just want their money, she said firmly. I want change. I want better hiring practices, mandatory reporting training, background checks that actually mean something. I want to make sure this never happens to another child. Linda nodded, a faint smile breaking her otherwise stoic expression. We can demand both. Policy changes and compensation. They owe you that much. At Riverside Elementary, Ms. Collins sat in the principal's office, recounting the safety assembly from the previous week. I had no idea Ethan would need that information so soon, she said, her voice shaking. When the police called and told me he used what we talked about, God, if we hadn't done that presentation, who knows how long this would have gone on. Principal Martinez nodded, her expression grim. This is a wake-up call for all of us, she said. We need to do better. I'm implementing new protocols immediately. Mandatory abuse recognition training for all staff, an anonymous tip line for students, and stricter background checks for incoming employees. Back at the hospital, Lily Baker sat up in her bed, her sprained wrist resting in a sling. Ethan climbed onto the edge of her bed, holding out the clay turtle he'd made for her art show. "I made it blue," he said proudly. "'Cause that's your favorite color, even though real turtles aren't blue." Lily's lips curved into a small smile, tears welling in her eyes as she took the turtle from him. "It's perfect," she whispered. Ethan tilted his head, studying her face. "Does it hurt?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Not so much now," Lily replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. She looked down at the turtle in her hands, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for calling them, for seeing what was happening, even when no one else did." Ethan's face grew serious. "Miss Collins says sometimes kids can see things better than grown-ups," he said. "She says we should trust our feelings." Dr. Morris watched the siblings from the doorway, her heart aching at the sight. She turned to Grace, who stood beside her. "Their bond is remarkable," Dr. Morris said softly. "Ethan's actions didn't just save Lily. They showed her she's worth protecting, that she has value." Grace wiped a tear from her cheek, her resolve hardening. "I'm going to make this right," she said, "for both of them." By evening, Detective Chun had compiled enough evidence to ensure Richard Cooper would never teach again. The case had opened a floodgate, with more former students coming forward to share their stories of emotional abuse and intimidation. Each account reinforced the pattern, painting a chilling picture of a predator who had operated unchecked for years. As Chun added one final note to her report, she felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The truth had finally come to light, and the silence that had protected Richard for so long was shattered. But as she closed the file, she knew this was only the beginning. The road to healing for Lily, Ethan, and Grace would be long, but they were no longer walking it alone. The courthouse loomed large in the crisp morning air, its brick facade catching the early sunlight. Lily stood at the bottom of the steps, her hand tightly clasped in her mother's. On her other side, Ethan held her hand, his small fingers curling protectively around hers. The three of them formed a small chain of strength, their faces solemn as they prepared to step inside. District Attorney Sarah Martinez approached, her briefcase swinging at her side. She offered them a reassuring smile. "Are you ready?" Martinez asked gently, her eyes meeting Lily's. Lily hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the courthouse doors. "Do I have to look at him?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Martinez shook her head. "No, sweetheart. You don't have to look at him. Just look at me, or your mom, or Ethan. And remember, your brother's testimony yesterday was so strong that we might not even need you to speak." Lily nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. Her grip on Ethan's hand tightened, and he gave her a small, encouraging smile. "You've got this," he said softly. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The rows of wooden benches were filled with reporters, survivors, and supporters. At the front of the room, Richard Cooper sat in his orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. His once commanding presence was diminished, his shoulders hunched and his face pale. He avoided looking toward the Baker family, instead focusing on his attorney. Detective Diana Chun sat beside a row of former students, including Emma Walsh and Sophie Carter, each girl representing a different chapter in Richard's history of abuse. They had all come to support Lily, standing together to ensure that the truth was finally heard. The prosecutor's opening statement was clear and concise, laying bare the years of systematic abuse Richard had inflicted. Richard Cooper used his position as an educator to identify, isolate, and manipulate vulnerable young girls, Martinez began. He moved from school to school, leaving behind a trail of shattered confidence and silenced voices. But today, those voices will be heard. The first to testify was Margaret Winters, the retired vice principal who had spent years tracking Richard's behavior. She read from her meticulous notes, detailing the informal complaints and the patterns she had observed. Student A, age 12, crying in the bathroom after a conference with Mr. Cooper. Reported being called worthless and stupid. Winters recounted. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were filled with regret. "Every time I tried to raise these issues, he transferred before a formal investigation could begin." Emma Walsh followed, her voice strong despite the tremor in her hands. She described how Richard's emotional abuse had driven her to the brink of suicide. "He kept me, after class, telling me I was pathetic, that no one would ever believe me. I started to believe him," she said, her gaze never wavering. Next came Ethan's testimony, played back on video to spare him the trauma of speaking in the courtroom again. The room fell silent as his small voice filled the space, recounting how he had recognized the signs of abuse and called 911. Lily stopped being Lily, his voice said simply. She got quiet and scared. Richard acted nice when Mom was home, but mean when she wasn't. Miss Collins said to call if someone was in danger, so I did. During a break, Lily sat in a private room with Dr. Morris, practicing breathing exercises. "Everyone's so brave," Lily whispered. "Emma, Miss Winters, Ethan, they're all speaking up," Dr. Morris smiled gently. "You gave them strength, Lily. Your story showed them they weren't alone, that they deserved to be heard." When the court resumed, the prosecutor presented the physical evidence, photographs of Lily's injuries, medical reports, and the journal found in her room. Each page documented months of abuse, painting a chilling picture of Richard's escalating violence. Richard's defense attempted to paint him as a strict but caring teacher, trying to help struggling students. But the overwhelming evidence and testimony left little room for doubt. The systematic nature of his abuse, documented across years and multiple schools, was undeniable. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence reflected the severity of Richard's crimes. 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15. His teaching license was permanently revoked, and he would never be allowed near children again. As Richard was led away, he finally turned to face the survivors. But instead of the frightened girls he had once tormented, he saw a row of young women standing tall, their strength shining through their shared pain. At the end of the row stood Lily, no longer hunching to make herself smaller. Ethan's small hand was still firmly in hers. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to hear Grace Baker's statement. Her voice was firm as she spoke about the institutional changes being implemented in the school system. Mandatory reporting training, better background checks, and stricter protocols for investigating complaints, she said. "We pushed for these changes because no family should ever have to go through what we did." But the real story was unfolding on the courthouse steps, where a group of survivors stood together in the autumn sunlight. Their silence had been broken, and in its place, a new sense of solidarity and strength had taken root. Ethan tugged at Lily's sleeve, his voice breaking through the moment. "Can we get ice cream?" The question, so normal, after such an extraordinary day, startled a laugh from Lily. She ruffled his hair, her smile widening. "Yeah, ice cream sounds perfect." The three of them walked down the courthouse steps together, mother, daughter, and saw toward a future they had fought hard to reclaim. Behind them, Emma Walsh smiled through tears. Margaret Winters stood straighter, and Detective Chun closed her file on the case that had exposed years of hidden abuse. The truth had emerged, justice had been served, and a family had stood strong together. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage come from the smallest voices willing to speak up. 3 months had passed since the courtroom doors had closed on Richard Cooper's trial, but the echoes of that day still rippled through the lives of those he had affected. Cedar Street had begun to heal, but the scars were still visible in small, quiet moments. For Grace, Lily, and Ethan Baker, life was about creating a new Normalone built on truth, resilience, and hope. The Baker home had been transformed, both physically and emotionally. Freshly painted walls replaced the once muted tones, and new furniture adorned the living room, chosen by Lily and Ethan during a rare outing that had brought laughter and lighthearted arguments over colors. Every trace of Richard had been erased, but the memories lingered. Lily sat at her desk, her fingers tapping lightly against her math textbook. It was the same book that had once filled her with dread, a symbol of her stepfather's constant criticism. But now, it felt different. She had started working with a tutor twice a week, and while math was still a challenge, it no longer felt insurmountable. Across the room, the small clay turtle Ethan had made for her rested on her bedside table, a quiet reminder of the bond that had kept her going. "Lily." Ethan's voice carried up the stairs, his tone impatient. "You promised to help me with my project." She smiled faintly, closing her textbook and heading downstairs. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by construction paper, glue, and markers. His second-grade class was working on a "What Makes a Hero" project, and he was determined to get every detail right. "Okay, what do you need help with?" Lily asked, sitting beside him. Ethan held up a drawing of 2 figures holding hands, one tall and one small. The taller figure's shirt was colored blue, her favorite color. "I'm writing about you," he said matter-of-factly. "You're my hero." Lily's breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She reached out and ruffled his hair, her voice thick with emotion. "Thanksy, but you're the real hero, you know. You're the one who saved me." Ethan shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Miss Collins says, heroes come in all sizes, so we're both heroes." The sound of the doorbell interrupted them, and Grace appeared from the living room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I'll get it," she said, opening the door to find Detective Chun standing on the porch, a thick envelope in her hands. "Good afternoon," Chun said with a small smile. "I'm here to drop off the final report and some updates on the school district's changes. Can I come in?" Grace stepped aside, motioning her in. The house felt warm and lived in, a stark contrast to the tense, quiet place it had been months ago. Chun followed Grace to the kitchen, where Ethan and Lily sat at the table, their projects spread out before them. "Hi, Detective Chun," Ethan said brightly. "Look, I'm making a hero project." Chun leaned over to examine his work, her smile widening. "That's amazing, Ethan. You're doing a great job." Lily watched the interaction with quiet appreciation, marveling at how comfortable Ethan had become around adults again. She still struggled with trust, but seeing her brother thrive gave her hope. Chun placed the envelope on the table and turned to Grace. "The school board officially implemented all the changes we discussed," she said. "Mandatory reporting training for staff, anonymous tip lines for students, and stricter background checks. They're calling it the Baker Initiative." Grace's eyes widened. "The Baker Initiative?" Chun nodded. Lily's bravery and Ethan's quick thinking were the catalysts for these changes. The board felt it was only right to name it after your family. Lily's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I deserve that," she murmured. Chun crouched slightly to meet Lily's eyes. "You do," she said firmly. "You stood up to something unimaginable. And because of you, countless other kids will be safer." Later that evening, the Bakers gathered in the living room for movie night, a tradition they had recently revived. Ethan was curled up on the couch with Rex, and Lily sat beside him, her head resting on Grace's shoulder. The television flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the room. As the movie played, Grace's thoughts drifted to the journey they had been on. The support group she had joined for parents of abuse survivors had been a lifeline, helping her navigate the guilt and pain she carried. Lily had started therapy with Dr. Morris and was slowly reclaiming pieces of herself that had been lost. And Ethan, her brave, perceptive little boy, had shown a resilience beyond his years. "Mom?" Lily's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Do you think we'll ever be okay? Like, really okay?" Grace looked at her daughter, her heart aching with both love and sorrow. "I think okay looks different for everyone," she said carefully. "But yes, I do. Because we're working toward it together. And we're stronger than we ever knew." Ethan piped up, his voice sleepy but firm. "We're like superheroes." Lily chuckled softly, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Yeah, we are." As the credits rolled and the room fell quiet, the Bakers sat together, a family reshaped by their experiences but unbroken. The light from the television cast gentle shadows on the walls, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt truly safe. Outside, the trees along Cedar Street swayed in the evening breeze, their bare branches reaching toward the sky, a quiet reminder that even in the harshest winters, new growth was always possible. Spring had fully arrived on Cedar Street, bringing with it the promise of renewal. The Baker family was preparing for an event that symbolized not just their healing, but the broader change their courage had sparked. They stood in front of the governor's mansion, where a ceremony was about to take place to officially sign the new protection laws into effect. Dubbed the Baker Initiative, these laws aimed to prevent what had happened to Lily and so many others from ever happening again. Lily adjusted her dress nervously, her fingers brushing over the hem. She still wasn't used to being the center of attention, but she was determined to stand tall today. Beside her, Ethan clutched Rex, his ever-present stuffed dinosaur, and offered her an encouraging smile. "You'll do great," he said confidently. Grace placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, her voice calm and reassuring. "Just speak from the heart, sweetheart. You've already done the hardest part by living through it." As they approached the podium, applause rippled through the crowd of legislators, reporters, and supporters. The governor, a tall man with a commanding presence, stepped forward to introduce them. "Today, We honor a family whose bravery and determination have brought us to this moment, he said. The Baker family story is a powerful reminder of why we must always protect our most vulnerable. Their courage has not only ensured justice for their own family, but has paved the way for systemic change that will protect countless others. He turned to Lily. "Lily Baker, would you like to say a few words?" Lily took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. The crowd quieted, their attention focused entirely on her. For a moment, she hesitated, but then she caught sight of Ethan, his face full of pride and support, and Grace, her eyes brimming with encouragement. "Good morning," Lily began, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. I never thought I'd be standing here. For a long time, I felt invisible, like my voice didn't matter. But my brother, Ethan, he saw me. He believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. And because of him, I found the courage to speak up." Her eyes scanned the crowd, landing on a group of young girls sitting in the front row. "To anyone out there who feels scared or unheard, I want you to know that your voice matters. You are not alone, and there are people who will stand with you." The applause was thunderous as she stepped back, her face flushed but triumphant. Grace wrapped her arm around Lily's shoulders, and Ethan gave her a thumbs up. The governor signed the legislation moments later, the pen's stroke marking the culmination of months of advocacy and determination. Cameras flashed, and the crowd erupted in cheers. For the Bakers, it was a moment of vindication, a tangible reminder that their pain had not been in vain. Later that afternoon, the family returned to their now cozy home, the sunlight streaming through the open windows. Lily changed into her soccer uniform, preparing for her first game since rejoining the team. The number 14 stretched across her back, a symbol of the life she was reclaiming. "Are you nervous?" Grace asked as they loaded into the car. Lily shook her head. I'm excited. It feels good to be me again." At the soccer field, the atmosphere was electric. Parents set up chairs on the sidelines. Kids warmed up, and coaches organized drills. Lily spotted Sophie, her best friend, waving enthusiastically from the field. "You're just in time," Sophie called as Lily jogged over. "We're doing shooting practice first." From the sidelines, Ethan cheered loudly, his small voice carrying across the field. Grace sat beside him, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her daughter reclaim a piece of her identity. The whistle blew, and the game began. Lily moved across the field with confidence, her movements fluid and purposeful. When she scored her first goal, the celebration was pure joy. She raised her arms to the sky, her face lit with triumph. "That's my sister," Ethan shouted, jumping up and down. "That's my big sister." After the game, the family gathered for ice cream, a simple but meaningful tradition that had become their way of celebrating life's victories. As they sat on a bench outside the shop, the spring air cool against their skin, Grace looked at her children and felt a deep sense of gratitude. "I have something to tell you both," she said, her voice serious but tinged with excitement. "The governor's office wants us to be part of a new task force. They want us to help shape policies and speak to other families about recognizing and reporting abuse." Lily and Ethan exchanged a look, their silent communication stronger than ever. "I want to do it," Lily said firmly. "People need to know it's okay to ask for help." "Me too," Ethan added. "Miss Collins says our story helps other kids be brave." Grace smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Then it's settled. We'll do it together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Bakers walked home hand in hand. Their journey had been fraught with pain and challenges, but they had emerged stronger, bound by love and a shared determination to make a difference. On Cedar Street, the lights in the Baker house glowed warmly, a beacon of hope in the quiet neighborhood. Inside, laughter echoed through the rooms. And for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. The Bakers had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about using it to build a better tomorrow. And as they sat together, planning their next steps, they knew one thing for certain. Their voices, once silenced, would now echo far and wide, ensuring that no one else would have to suffer in silence again. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that will make your day brighter. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and share it with someone who could use some positivity today.